The surface of deep water can be the most deceptive thing on earth. It lies still and silent, reflecting the sky like a mirror, promising tranquility. But beneath that glass facade, in the lightless depths, ancient things stir, and sometimes they remember. We went to Lake Vermilion, seeking peace. My friend Sarah had inherited a remote cabin there, miles from the nearest town, perched right on the water's edge, surrounded by dense, old-growth forest. It was late autumn, the kind of time where the air bites with the promise of winter, and the leaves are a riot of dying color. Just the four of us, Sarah, her husband Mark, my partner Liam, and myself. We needed a break, a true escape from the constant noise and demands of city life. The cabin was perfect, rustic, cozy, with a massive stone fireplace and windows that looked directly out onto the vast, dark expanse of the lake. The isolation was exactly what we craved. No cell service, no internet, just us, the woods, and the quiet water. For the first day, it was idyllic. Long walks in the crisp air, evenings spent by the fire sharing stories, the only sounds the crackling wood and the occasional call of a distant owl. The lake remained silent, beautiful, and utterly still. It felt like we had found a hidden corner of the world, untouched by anything unpleasant. The shift was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. On our second afternoon, sitting on the small wooden dock, dangling our feet just above the frigid water, we noticed a series of odd ripples far out on the lake. They weren't random, like wind-driven waves. They moved with a purpose, radiating outwards from a central point that seemed to shift and change, almost like something large was swimming just below the surface. But it was too late in the season for most lake animals of any size to be so active, and it wasn't the smooth V-shaped wake of a boat. It was more churning, like heavy machinery moving through mud. We joked that maybe the lake had its own monster, a local Nessie. Mark said it was probably just some strange current or thermals. Liam, ever the pragmatist, suggested it was a school of large fish, but it looked too singular, too deliberate for that. The ripples eventually faded, leaving the surface calm once more. But a tiny sliver of unease had lodged itself in the back of our minds. We went inside as the sun began to set, shaking off the strange sight. That night, the sounds started. They were low at first, barely audible over the wind that had picked up outside. A deep thrumming, like a giant pulse echoing through the earth, seemingly coming from the deepest part of the lake. Then, interspersed with the thrumming, was a new noise, a heavy, wet, dragging sound, as if something immense was being pulled across a rocky bottom, or perhaps pulling itself towards something. We gathered in the living room, the firelight casting flickering shadows, trying to identify the noises. They weren't the familiar sounds of the wilderness. No animal we knew made these sounds. They were rhythmic, deliberate, and filled the quiet cabin with a palpable tension. Sarah looked pale, her earlier jests about a lake monster long forgotten. Mark checked the doors and windows, though we all knew whatever was making those sounds wasn't small enough to sneak in easily. The noises continued for hours, a relentless, unnerving serenade from the dark water outside, fading only as the first hint of dawn touched the sky. We slept little, if at all. The next morning, the sounds were gone. The lake was once again a sheet of glass, innocent and silent under the gray sky. We tried to dismiss it as just strange acoustics, amplified wind, or maybe even seismic activity, though that felt like a stretch. But the unease remained. After a tense breakfast, curiosity, or perhaps a morbid need for confirmation, drove Mark and Liam down to the dock. Sarah and I watched from the windows, our hearts pounding. They carefully walked the length of the old wood. It looked normal at first. Then Mark knelt at the very end, near the water's edge. He pointed downwards. Liam leaned over, then straightened up quickly, a look of horror on his face. They came back up to the cabin, their boots tracking mud. Mark held up his phone, showing us a picture he'd taken. There, just below the waterline on the large wooden support beams of the dock, were deep, ragged gouges, like something with enormous claws had tried to pull itself up or had deliberately carved into the wood. And in the damp earth near the base of the dock, leading back towards the water, were faint, heavy indentations that didn't look like any animal track any of us had ever seen. They were too wide, too irregular. Sarah remembered an old binder the host had left, filled with local lore and history. We dug it out, flipping through dusty pages about the area. Buried deep within a section on local legends, tucked away after stories of loggers and lost miners, was a brief, chilling account of the lake's original inhabitants, a small, isolated community that had mysteriously vanished centuries ago. The story mentioned whispers of something dark living in the water, an ancient spirit or a creature that demanded tribute, sometimes in the form of the people themselves. It was dismissed as folklore, but reading it now, looking at the photos of the gouges and tracks, felt terrifyingly real. As dusk settled in again, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just coming from the lake anymore. It felt like it surrounded the property. We huddled together in the living room, the fire doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in our bones. The low thrumming started again, closer this time, vibrating through the floorboards. Then came the dragging sound, no longer distant, but right outside, along the shoreline just beyond the edge of the light cast by the cabin windows. We pressed our faces to the glass, peering out into the growing darkness, seeing only the distorted reflections of our own terrified faces. But then, a flicker of movement in the periphery, a shape, indistinct against the trees and water, moving slowly, deliberately, right at the edge of the property line. It was large, ungainly, and seemed to emit a low, wet rasping sound with each movement. It wasn't walking upright like a person, but somehow lower to the ground, hauling itself forward. We scrambled away from the windows, the horror of seeing something real replacing the fear of just hearing it. It was coming towards the house. Then came the sounds directly against the cabin walls. A heavy, wet thudding, as if something was repeatedly bumping against the foundation. A dreadful scraping, like thick claws being dragged across the wood siding just inches from where we stood. We could hear it testing the barriers of the house, exploring the perimeter, searching for an entry point. The sounds were slow, methodical, relentless, and filled the small cabin with a suffocating dread. Every creak of the old house, every groan of the wood in the wind made us jump. We moved as one. trying to be silent, our eyes wide with fear, listening to the sounds of something large and unknown trying to get in. It wasn't a burglar. This was something far older, far more patient, and infinitely more terrifying. We were trapped. The dark water on one side, the impenetrable forest on the other, and this thing right outside our walls. And then the sounds moved inside. There was no crash of glass, no splintering of wood, just a sudden, chilling silence outside, followed by a soft, wet dripping sound from the back of the house, near the unused utility room. Then a heavy footfall on the floorboards upstairs, directly over our heads. We froze, listening. Another step, slow, deliberate. It was inside. How? Had it found an old pipe, a crawl space? We didn't know, but it no longer mattered. Our sanctuary had been breached. A low guttural growl echoed from the stairwell. We flattened ourselves against the wall, our breath catching in our throats. A shadow detached itself from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs. Too tall, too wide, with a shape that seemed to shift and writhe even as we watched. Two pinpricks of reflected light glinted in the gloom, eyes that seemed to stare right through us. It let out another wet rattling sound that was not a roar, but something far more unnerving, like water being forced through constricted lungs. It moved into the living room, its form difficult to discern in the low light, but its presence overwhelming. We could smell the lake on it, the cold, muddy, stagnant scent of the deep. Panic surged through us. There was no fight, no resistance, just pure, primal terror. "The car," Sarah whispered, pointing frantically towards the front door. It was our only chance. We bolted, a frantic dash across the living room, past the terrifying shadow, towards the door. The creature reacted instantly, a wet roar filling the air, heavy footsteps pounding behind us. We fumbled with the locks, hands shaking uncontrollably. Liam wrenched the door open, and we spilled out into the cold night air, not even bothering to close it behind us. We ran blindly across the frozen ground, towards where the car was parked near the tree line. The sounds of tearing wood erupted from the cabin behind us, followed by a guttural shriek that seemed to tear through the night itself. We didn't look back. We piled into the car, Mark fumbling with the keys, the engine turning over sluggishly in the cold. He slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning on the frozen earth, backing violently away from the cabin. As we fishtailed onto the narrow, winding road leading away from the lake, a fleeting image caught in the headlights in the rearview mirror. A massive, dark shape silhouetted against the cabin, hunched over something we couldn't make out before the trees swallowed it up. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the first sign of civilization, a brightly lit gas station on a highway miles away. Shivering, soaked in sweat despite the cold, we called the police. When they finally made it to the cabin the next day, they found the front door hanging open, splintered as if something had burst through it from the inside. But the cabin was empty. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no evidence that anything other than us had been there. The gouges on the dock were dismissed as old damage, the tracks on the bank as animal prints distorted by the freezing earth. The police, professional but skeptical,
chalked it up to fear, isolation, and overactive imaginations in a remote location. They found nothing, but we know what we saw, what we heard. The tranquility of Lake Vermilion, like the tranquil surface of any deep water, hides an ancient, hungry darkness, and we had woken it up. We never went back, and the thought of that cabin, sitting silent by the deceptive lake, still fills us with a cold dread. Some things are better left undisturbed, lurking in the quiet depths.